August 7th, 1942. The Solomon Islands. The air on Guadalcanal is not merely oxygen. It is a thick, stagnant soup of decaying vegetation, salt spray, and the metallic tang of impending rain. Beneath the canopy of the Lunga River basin, the light is filtered into a sickly, jaundiced green. Here, the silence is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drone of cicadas that sounds like a sharpening blade. A lone American scout moves through the kunai grass, his uniform darkened to a charcoal hue by sweat and river water. He stops. The jungle has gone quiet, a sudden, unnatural vacuum of sound. Before he can chamber around in his M1 Garand, the emerald curtain shatters. Shadows in mustard khaki burst from the undergrowth. There is no honorable parley, only the blunt force of a rifle butt to the temple, and the cold shock of steel against skin. As he is forced to the mud, a jagged blade flashes in the dappled light. A searing, white-hot agony explodes on the side of his head, followed by the wet thud of something hitting the leaves. The Japanese patrol laughs, a sharp, staccato sound that ignores the monster they have just unleashed. The blood begins to pool in the dirt, but the soldiers' eyes do not close. They sharpen, fixating on the 41 men who believe the fight is already over. The war in the Pacific was never a conflict of clean lines or predictable maneuvers. It was a grueling war of attrition, fought in some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. By mid-1942, the Empire of Japan had expanded its reach across the vast expanses of the South Seas, creating a defensive perimeter that seemed impenetrable to the reeling Allied forces. The focal point of this expansion had shifted toward the Solomon Islands, a jagged archipelago that held the key to the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If the Japanese could complete an airfield on the island of Guadalcanal, their long-range bombers could sever the Allied lifeline, effectively knocking Australia out of the war and forcing a stalemate in the Pacific. The American response, codenamed Operation Watchtower, was the United States' first major offensive of the war. It was a gamble of desperate proportions. The men sent into this green hell were largely untested, belonging to the 1st Marine Division, and later reinforced by the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. They arrived on the beaches to find a world that felt alien and hostile. The jungle was not just a backdrop for the fighting. It was an active combatant. Temperatures regularly soared above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, while humidity levels hovered near 100%. The ground was a morass of stinking black mud that rotted boots and skin alike. In this environment, the technological superiority of the United States, its heavy artillery, its industrial might, its massive naval vessels, was often neutralized by the density of the foliage. Behind the Japanese lines, the special naval landing forces and the elite infantry units of the Imperial Japanese Army had spent years perfecting the art of night attacks and jungle infiltration. They were masters of camouflage and psychological warfare. To the average American soldier, the Japanese warrior was a ghost, a terrifying, invisible force that could appear from the canopy or the earth itself. The Japanese doctrine of Bushido emphasized an absolute refusal to surrender and a total commitment to the destruction of the enemy, often through brutal hand-to-hand combat. This created a theater of war defined by a lack of mercy, where prisoners were rarely taken, and those who were often faced a fate far worse than a quick death on the battlefield. By the time our scout found himself isolated near the banks of the Matanikau River, the campaign had devolved into a series of savage small unit actions. The front line was a fluid concept, often existing only where a man stood with his rifle. Patrolling was the primary means of survival and intelligence gathering. But it was a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek where the loser was usually dead before he heard the shot. The American military leadership was desperate for information on Japanese troop movements, pushing small patrols deeper and deeper into the bush. It was during one of these deep penetration probes that the balance of power shifted from a coordinated military operation to a singular, primal struggle for survival. The strategic reality on the ground was further complicated by the Japanese 17th Army's shifting tactics. Having underestimated the initial American landing force, the Japanese command began funneling thousands of seasoned veterans from the Manchurian campaigns into the Solomon Theater. These men were not the raw recruits the Americans had expected. They were hardened survivors of the Second Sino-Japanese War, conditioned to believe in the inherent spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior. They viewed the American soldier as soft, a creature of comfort, who would crumble without the support of heavy machinery and abundant rations. This cultural miscalculation would become the catalyst for the slaughter that was to follow. The specific area where the scout was operating, a series of ridges and ravines overlooking the Matanikau, was a tactical nightmare. The terrain was vertical, covered in razor-sharp kunai grass that could slice through clothing and skin. Beneath the grass, the ground was a network of limestone caves and volcanic roots, providing 1,000 hiding places for an ambush. The Japanese patrol, a reinforced platoon of 41 men, had been moving through this sector with the intent of finding a weak point in the American flank. They were not looking for a fight, they were looking for a massacre. When they stumbled upon the lone American, they saw not a threat, but a trophy, a chance to extract information through pain and to demoralize any other allies lurking in the brush. The act of mutilation, the slicing of the ear, was a calculated psychological blow. In the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army, such acts were intended to break the prisoner's will instantly, turning a soldier into a victim. They expected the man to collapse into shock, to weep, or to beg. They did not account for the specific chemical cocktail of adrenaline, rage, and survival instinct that can override the brain's sensory input. The scout was a man who had grown up hunting in the woods and working steel, possessed of a rugged pragmatism that the Japanese high command had failed to factor into their racial theories of the war. As the Japanese soldiers laughed, momentarily distracted by their own perceived dominance, the strategic situation narrowed down to a single square of muddy earth. The 41 men began to relax their guard, some lowering their weapons to light cigarettes, others moving to search the scouts' gear. They believed the battle was over before it had truly begun. They were deep within their own controlled territory, far from any Allied support, and they held all the cards. But in the dense humidity of the Matanikau, the American was already calculating. He was measuring the distance to his dropped rifle, the position of the officer's Nambu pistol, and the density of the brush to his left. The transition from captive to combatant happened in a heartbeat. The Japanese had committed the ultimate military sin. They had left their enemy with nothing to lose. With blood streaming down his neck and his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, the scout reached a state of cold, crystalline clarity. The pain was still there, a throbbing roar in his skull, but it was now a fuel rather than a hindrance. The 36-minute window that would define his life and end 41 others was about to open. To understand how a single man could dismantle a reinforced platoon in just over half an hour, one must first look at the tools of the trade. In the close quarters nightmare of the Pacific, the M1 Garand was more than a rifle. It was a revolution. While the Japanese patrol carried the bolt-action Arisaka Type 38, a long, elegant weapon designed for the open plains of Manchuria, the American was armed with a semi-automatic powerhouse. The Arisaka required the soldier to manually cycle the bolt after every shot, a movement that was cumbersome in the tangle of vines and grass. The Garand, however, allowed the scout to fire 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition as fast as he could pull the trigger. In the initial seconds of the counterattack, this rate of fire would create the illusion of a much larger force, sowing immediate and lethal confusion among the Japanese ranks. Beyond the firearms, the utility of the combat knife played a vital role. When the distance closed to 0, the scout relied on the kabar, or the M1 bayonet. These were not just ceremonial blades, they were heavy, utilitarian tools designed for the visceral reality of hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese, conversely, were trained in jujutsu and bayonet charging, a doctrine that relied on the psychological shock of the charge. But the scout's combat style was born of desperation and the raw, unrefined instinct of a brawler. He didn't fight for honor or the emperor. He fought with the focused, mechanical efficiency of a man clearing a path through an obstruction. This technological and tactical disparity meant that every American bullet and every knife thrust had a multiplicative effect in the cramped, low-visibility environment. There is also the psychological phenomenon of the Berserker State. Historically, when a human being suffers a traumatic injury and remains conscious, the endocrine system floods the body with a massive dose of norepinephrine. This physiological overclocking narrows the field of vision to the immediate threat, dampens the perception of pain, and accelerates reaction times. The Japanese patrol saw a wounded prisoner. They did not realize they were looking at a man whose nervous system had effectively bypassed his inhibitory centers. This wasn't a madness, but a terrifyingly high level of function. In the mind of the scout, the 41 Japanese soldiers were no longer men. They were targets in a sequence that needed to be completed. Finally, there is the angle of the underestimated adversary. The Japanese Imperial Army's training manuals at the time frequently characterized Western soldiers as decadent and lacking in fighting spirit. They believed that once an American was wounded or isolated, his morale would vanish. This racial and cultural hubris was their greatest tactical error. By mocking the scout and failing to properly bind or blindfold him, they allowed him to maintain situational awareness. They treated him as a carcass before he was dead. This arrogance created a fatal lag in their reaction time. When the scout lunged for the officer's weapon, the Japanese were caught in a moment of cognitive dissonance. They couldn't reconcile the broken man they saw with the whirlwind of violence that was suddenly in their midst. The environment itself functioned as the silent arbiter of the engagement. In the Matanikau region, the jungle floor is a vertical maze of limestone outcrops and ancient mahogany roots draped in strangler figs. Visibility was often limited to less than 15 feet. For a large patrol of 41 men, this terrain was a logistical nightmare that forced them into a tight, linear formation along a narrow ridge trail. For a single man, however, the density of the brush became a shield. By staying low and moving laterally, the scout could disappear into the shadows and reappear from an unexpected vector. He utilized the tunneling effect of the foliage to ensure that only 1 or 2 Japanese soldiers could engage him at any given time, effectively turning a 40-1 disadvantage into a series of one-on-one duels. The final factor involves the Japanese tactical reliance on the Nambu pistol and the Type 89 grenade discharger. While the knee mortar was a devastating weapon in open skirmishes, It was useless at the point-blank range where this struggle occurred. The Japanese officers who carried the 8mm Nambu pistol found their sidearms notoriously prone to jamming in the humid, muddy conditions. As the scout closed the distance, the Japanese officers discovered their primary means of defense were mechanical liabilities. The scout, conversely, had the advantage of battlefield pickup versatility. He was not limited to his own kit. As he eliminated each soldier, he stripped their grenades and ammunition, using their own ordnance to clear the path ahead. This convergence of factors created a tactical vacuum. The Japanese patrol possessed the numbers, but they lacked the spacing. They possessed the training, but they lacked the flexibility to respond to a lone actor who refused to follow the rules of engagement. They were a cohesive unit, which meant they relied on orders from their sergeant and officer. The very men the scout targeted in the opening seconds of his counter-attack. Without leadership, the patrol devolved from a disciplined military unit into 40 panicked individuals. This loss of cohesion in the face of an invisible high-velocity threat is what allowed the 36-minute clock to wind down toward its bloody conclusion. As the initial shock of the scout's surge began to fade, the Japanese soldiers tried to reform their line, screaming orders across the narrow ravine, but the jungle ghost was already gone, melting back into the kunai grass to reload and reposition. The psychological weight of the situation had shifted entirely. The hunters were now being hunted by a man they had believed was their prize. Every rustle of a leaf and every snap of a twig now signaled a potential death blow. The scout had transitioned from a prisoner to a force of nature, and the jungle was now his accomplice. The transition from victim to predator occurred at 14:14 hours. The Japanese officer, satisfied with his interrogation, had turned his back to look at a map, leaving the scout on his knees in the red clay. 2 guards stood loosely over him, their Arisaka rifles slung, a fatal gesture of complacency. With a guttural roar that bypassed his vocal cords, the scout lunged. He didn't go for his own rifle. He went for the officer's Nambu pistol. In one fluid motion, he wrenched the sidearm from its holster and fired upward. The first guard took a round through the chin. The second took 2 in the chest before he could unseat his bayonet. The sound of the Nambu's 8mm rounds was a starter's pistol. The Japanese patrol, scattered along 30 yards of the ridge trail, froze for a split second of pure cognitive dissonance. The scout didn't waste the moment. He dove for his discarded M1 Garand, rolling through the mud as the first Japanese rounds began to thud into the earth around him. He came up in a crouch, the Garand's walnut stock finding the pocket of his shoulder with practiced ease. 8 shots rang out in rapid succession. 4 Japanese soldiers who had been reaching for grenades or bolt handles were knocked backward into the ravine. The scout knew he couldn't stay in the clearing. He vanished into a wall of ferns just as a hail of Japanese fire shredded the spot where he had stood. The Japanese sergeant, realizing the gravity of the situation, began screaming orders to flank the American. But the American wasn't staying still. He was moving in a wide arc, his boots finding purchase on the slick roots of mahogany trees. He was operating on a subconscious map of the immediate terrain, using the density of the undergrowth to mask his silhouette. At the 10-minute mark, the Japanese patrol had lost 12 men. The confusion was absolute. Because the scout was firing from different locations in rapid succession, the Japanese believed they were being engaged by a full squad. They began firing blindly into the foliage, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. The scout, however, was disciplined. He waited for the muzzle flashes, for the sound of a shouting voice, for the slight sway of a branch that wasn't caused by the wind. Every time he pulled the trigger, another Japanese soldier fell. He was stacking the bodies, using the casualties to create obstacles on the narrow trail, further constricting the patrol's ability to maneuver. The heat was becoming an adversary of its own. The scout's vision was blurring from the blood loss and the stinging sweat, but the adrenaline remained a cold, steady hand on his shoulder. He checked his pockets. 3 clips left. 24 rounds. He had 30 men to go. He reached into the webbing of a fallen Japanese soldier and pulled out 2 Type 97 hand grenades. He knew the mechanism. Pull the pin, strike the head against a hard surface to prime the fuse. He waited, listening to the frantic chatter of the Japanese soldiers trying to regroup near a large limestone outcropping. They were huddling, seeking the safety of numbers, the exact mistake he needed them to make. The timer in the scout's head reached the 20-minute mark. The Japanese patrol, once a disciplined unit, was now a fractured collection of terrified men. The ridge had become a slaughterhouse of slick clay and tangled limbs. The scout moved like a predator through the kunai grass, his breathing shallow and ragged, his left side numb from the blood loss where his ear had been. He reached the limestone outcropping where the largest concentration of the patrol had taken cover. They were shouting, trying to coordinate a bayonet charge into the brush where they thought he was hiding. He didn't give them the chance. He struck the first Type 97 grenade against his boot and counted a single heartbeat before lobbing it over the rock. The explosion was a dull crump in the humid air, followed immediately by the second. Shrapnel and screams tore through the canopy. Before the smoke could clear, the scout was over the top of the ledge. He fired the Garand from the hip, the 30-06 rounds punching through the thin, khaki uniforms of the survivors at point-blank range. When the rifle clicked empty, its iconic metallic ping signaling an empty clip, a Japanese soldier lunged with a bayonet. The scout didn't reload. He swung the heavy rifle like a club, the steel butt plate shattering the man's jaw, then finished the job with a fallen soldier's own bayonet. The final 10 minutes were a blur of primal violence. The remaining Japanese soldiers, realizing they were being systematically hunted by a ghost, began to break. Some tried to flee down the steep ravine toward the Matanikau River, but the scout had anticipated the retreat. He had positioned himself at the only viable exit point. One by one, he picked them off as they struggled through the waist-high grass. His vision was tunneling now, the world reduced to the front side post of his rifle and the movement of khaki shadows. He was no longer a man, he was a machine of retribution, executing his training with a cold, mechanical fury. By 1450 hours, the jungle had returned to its heavy, oppressive silence. The smell of cordite and iron hung thick in the air. The scout stood in the center of the trail, his chest heaving, his uniform shredded and soaked in a mixture of his own blood and that of his enemies. He looked down at the bodies. 41 men laid out across less than 100 yards of trail. He checked his watch. 36 minutes had passed since the knife had touched his skin. The trophy had become the executioner. He didn't celebrate. He didn't scream. He simply began the agonizing crawl back toward the American lines, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would haunt the survivors of the 17th Army for the rest of the campaign. The last Japanese soldier he encountered wasn't even a fight. The man was wounded, propped against a mahogany root, Clutching a picture of a woman in Kyoto, the scout looked at him, his finger tightening on the trigger, then let the muzzle drop. He had no more bullets, and more importantly, he had no more hate. He turned and vanished into the emerald shadows, leaving the dying man to the silence of the Solomons. The engagement was over, but the myth of the man who killed 41 was just beginning to take root in the mud of Guadalcanal. The discovery of the engagement site occurred 18 hours later, when a relief patrol from the 164th Infantry stumbled upon the ridge. The scene they encountered defied the standard geometry of a battlefield. Typically, a firefight leaves behind a chaotic scattering of shell casings and a clear line of engagement. Here, the American soldiers found a linear trail of absolute devastation. 41 Japanese soldiers lay dead in an area no larger than a city lot. The American commander on the scene would later receive reports detailing the sheer improbable nature of the sight. The bodies were found in clusters, many showing signs of hand-to-hand struggle, while others had been picked off with marksman-like precision from distances that seemed impossible in the thick brush. The scout had not died in the jungle. He had been found by a forward-listening post, barely conscious and delirious from blood loss and a skyrocketing fever. The medical report from the field hospital was a grim testament to his ordeal. His left ear had been crudely severed, leaving a jagged wound that had been cauterized only by the natural clotting of the humid air and the sheer luck of avoiding the carotid artery. He suffered from multiple shrapnel wounds, a fractured rib, and a severe concussion. Yet, as he was stabilized, he was able to provide a coherent account of the positions of the Japanese 17th Army. The intelligence he provided allowed the Americans to shift their heavy mortar batteries just in time to intercept a major counter-offensive. The psychological impact on the American troops was immediate and profound. On Guadalcanal, the jungle ghost became a legend whispered in the foxholes. For men who had lived in terror of the invisible Japanese infiltrator, the story of the scout offered a powerful counter-narrative. That a single determined American could not only survive an encounter with the Imperial Army, but could utterly dismantle them. It was a morale booster that served as a catalyst for a change in infantry mindset. The American soldier was no longer just a defender of an airfield. He was learning to become a predator in the dark. For the Japanese High Command, the incident was a terrifying omen. Captured documents and diaries from the Matanikau sector revealed a growing sense of dread among the rank-and-file Japanese soldiers. One diary entry spoke of a demon that haunted the ridges, a man who could not be killed and who fought with the ferocity of an Oni. The realization began to sink in. The Americans were not the soft, pampered soldiers the propaganda had described. They were becoming hardened, adaptable, and, most dangerously, unpredictable. The 41 men lost on that ridge represented more than just a tactical loss. They represented the death of the myth of Japanese jungle supremacy. The strategic consequences of the Matanikau engagement rippled far beyond the immediate body count. In the months following the incident, the U.S. military began a radical overhaul of their small unit training programs. The Jungle Ghost had proven that the M1 Garand semi-automatic fire was the ultimate equalizer in dense foliage. This led to a shift in doctrine that prioritized high-volume, short-range suppressive fire over traditional long-range marksmanship. Squads were increasingly equipped with more automatic weapons, moving away from a static defensive mindset and toward a more aggressive mobile form of jungle warfare. On the technological front, the failure of the Japanese sidearms and the success of the American equipment led to a renewed focus on reliability in tropical environments. The American military began issuing specialized jungle kits and lubricants that wouldn't gum up in the extreme humidity of the Solomons. The scout's survival, facilitated by his ability to utilize captured enemy ordnance, also spurred a new emphasis on cross-training, teaching soldiers how to operate enemy weaponry, ensuring that no one was ever truly unarmed on the battlefield. Diplomatically and psychologically, the story was studied at the highest levels of the War Department. It served as a case study in combat, stress, and resilience, helping military psychologists understand the flow state or berserker reaction that allowed men to perform at superhuman levels under extreme duress. This research eventually contributed to the development of modern psychiatric support for soldiers, recognizing that the trauma of such an event leaves scars that no medal can fully cover. The engagement also marked a turning point in the Japanese perception of the war. As reports of the Demon of the Ridge filtered back to Tokyo, the Imperial Command began to realize that the war would not be won by spiritual fervor alone. The Americans were adapting. The man who had been a peaceful civilian just months prior was now a lethal instrument of the state, capable of matching and exceeding the brutality of the ancient codes. The narrow trail by the Matanikau was no longer just a piece of ground. It was the birthplace of a new kind of American warrior, one who would eventually fight his way from the Solomons to the very gates of Tokyo. The story of the lone scout on the Matanikau is more than a footnote in the bloody history of the Pacific. It is a profound testament to the untapped reserves of the human spirit when pushed beyond the threshold of endurance. In the silence that followed the 36 minutes of violence, the jungle did not change, but the man within it did. He proved that even in a war defined by massive industrial machines, carrier groups, and heavy bombers, the ultimate factor remains the individual, the solitary heart capable of transforming agony into a terrifying, focused agency. What occurred on that ridge reveals a dark but necessary truth about the nature of conflict. War is not merely a contest of maps and logistics, but an encounter between two different versions of reality. The Japanese patrol operated under a reality of perceived spiritual superiority and collective discipline. The American operated under the reality of a man who refused to be a victim. When these two realities collided, the result was a visceral explosion of survivalism that transcended national borders and military doctrine. It reminds us that there is a line within every human being that, once crossed, transforms the hunted into something the hunter cannot conceive. Today, the kunai grass has long since reclaimed the ridges of Guadalcanal. The rust-eaten casings and the fragments of steel have been swallowed by the earth, hidden beneath layers of tropical silt and mahogany roots. Yet, the legacy of that 36-minute stand remains. It serves as a reminder of the cost of freedom and the terrible price of survival. In the face of overwhelming odds, when the world has been reduced to a knife's edge and a few seconds of breath, the capacity for one man to change the course of his own destiny and the fate of those around him is the most enduring weapon of all.